I think we've had an excellent setting of the scene there from one particular perspective. I must say, before tonight, I thought that SEPA was a very powerful organisation, but I hadn't realised it could stop the rain. That is some achievement. Very, very powerful. What I'm interested in doing is not so much looking at what the regulatory structure might be, because I think what Emma was talking about was, if this comes in, it begs the question, if this comes in. I'm interested in those questions that relate to that. So I'm coming from an upstream direction, and I'm interested in the public health aspects, and that's different to public health impact assessments, because people in public health are now looking at what could the hazards and the risks be relating to a process. What sort of data do we have, and how good are the data? And then, are there data gaps? And the public health approach is often driven by the precautionary principle. And this says if you've got reasonable data indicating there could be problems, and to a large number of people, and if there are data gaps that are significant and don't tell you everything you need to know, you should adopt a precautionary approach. That is, you fail to safety and you don't fail to danger. So that's where I'm coming from. And it's important to recognise that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I think in a public health context, what you want to see, wherever possible, is evidence that there will not be problems. And I think with unconventional gas, there's a lot going on. Now, I carry these slides around with me everywhere I go. You may or may not be able to see the pictures at the back. Can you? Yep. Top left, you might think could be Kilbirnie kids going out for a night on the town with all the protective gear. In fact, they are shale oil miners from the 1920s and the 1930s in the Central Belt. And you can see they've got a lot of kit on. And that's how the technology was then, quite primitive, high exposures and big difficulties. Now, from a public health point of view, you could get very hazardous substances and nobody could be exposed, and it's not a problem. In those days, you had very hazardous substances, people were exposed, and there were significant problems. The picture we're given now with regard to unconventional gas, be it coal bed methane, or which is here, but not in a big way, or fracking, which is not yet in Scotland, so we don't know exactly what the problems will be. We're given a picture of wells that are nicely contained and small in number. Emma has referred to that. It was interesting that with the DART proposal, they started off in terms of coal bed methane with a very small number of wells. And when they were asked how many wells there would really be, they didn't say, because they weren't required to. But in fact, it looks as if there could be hundreds of wells. So the picture that Emma gave about the US, in some senses, might possibly emerge in Scotland and in other parts of the UK. But we need to think about how we identify the problems, how quickly we identify the problems, and what precaution we take. Bottom left, you will not be able to see, but it's of two papers. Shale gas extraction for paraffin, which is slightly different to the setup now, began in the 1850s. It wasn't until the 1870s that they discovered that the workers suffered from major occupational diseases, very obvious occupational diseases. And it wasn't until 50 years later that they really started to tackle the problem. So it took a long, long time, many decades, for the problem to emerge, which was very obvious, chronic high-level exposures. And then, and only then, did they start to get to grips with it. Of course, now what we're seeing is nanotoxicology and nanotechnology, where we've got very small particles that could possibly be produced, and there could be very serious effects from them. Just to give you an idea of this, a nanoparticle is 1 to 100 nanometers, and a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter. So, toxicologists are now saying that you could get extremely low exposures in parts per billion, and indeed in parts per trillion, of various chemicals, and that could have an adverse effect on health. There's a very famous public health physician called Geoffrey Rose who said if you want to assess public health damage, you don't probably need to look at a small number of people who are exposed to very high levels of a substance. What you may need to look at is a large number of people exposed to a very small quantity of a substance if it's toxic. So I think that's what you want to keep in your head when you hear discussions about exposure levels and what the damage might be. So what I intend to do now is to have a look at some of those issues, to have a look at the principles and the tools that are used that might guide us and that you might want to think about, to have a look at the regulation and the public health issues, how those two things come together, then have a look at what industry has been doing and what sort of public health threats have been emerging and what independent assessment says about that, and finally to have a look at where we stand now and what perhaps should guide groups in terms of their decision making. So 25 years ago, WHO Europe produced a charter, and it said that there should be some basic things that communities should have, rights that individuals should have, things that government should do. And I think it's worth looking at how things develop now to see whether or not you've got these things. Because there should be a right to know, a right to participate, and a right to act for communities with regard to what's happening to their environment and also possibly to their public health. So the first part of the Charter was saying individuals are entitled to the highest level of health and well-being. Well, that's an aim. That's utopian, but at least that's the way we should be going. We may not achieve it, but that's an admirable aim. However, they also said individuals are entitled to information and consultation on the state of the environment, plans, decisions and activities. Now, when you look at what the unconventional gas industry is doing, it is simply not telling communities what the position is. It is not transparent. I was at a meeting with INEOS a little while ago, and one of the speakers said, we know that INEOS wants to develop in this area. Can you tell us where the wells will be? No answer. If everything is safe and if everything is transparent and they want to be open, why can't they fulfill that first criterion? Difficult to say. Principles for public policy then should be, as I sketched out at the beginning. First of all, prevention is better than cure, because you can't put the genie back in the bottle with regard to some things, with regard to some pollutants, with regard to chronic long-term exposures that may present significant hazards. And they're saying also there, 25 years ago, and this is something the World Health Organization has picked up very strongly, that the health of every individual, especially those of vulnerable and high-risk groups, should be protected. So vulnerable groups, for instance, would be the very young, they would be the very old, they would be people who are sick, they would be pregnant women. Those are areas that a lot of public health researchers are focusing on, particularly with regard to these extremely low exposures that might occur from a range of substances. They also said new technology should be introduced with prudence. So I think the picture that we're getting is that these are probably old technologies. So again, some of us in Glasgow 2 weeks ago heard from drillers and other oil workers who were involved in the process, not in the theory of the process, but in the process. And they came out with a long list of problems and failures with the process that is going to be used in terms of unconventional gas extraction. So how many of those appear, to what extent they're monitored, I think is going to be a big question. And thirdly, the principle that the WHO advocated was that the health of individuals and communities should take precedence over the economy and trade considerations. Now, I think most of us would say we need to consider economic growth, but as a priority for a public health regulator, the priority should be the health of the individuals and the communities. To what extent that happens is something that's worth discussing. So, the strategic elements then would be to have high standards of management and regulations, and that's something we can discuss. It would be to have standards set on the basis of best available scientific practice. And again, there may be some differences here, because the sort of scientific papers that I've been looking at don't suggest that necessarily unconventional gas extraction is a healthy and safe technology. And that we should, as Emma quite rightly referred to, get good data and baseline data. And again, it's very odd that the industry in other countries simply cannot tell us about the baseline data because they never collected it. And this also comes back to a standard problem. You don't look, or sometimes you don't have the means to look, you don't find, and then there isn't a problem. It's a vicious circle. So this is the sort of absence of evidence area. And that's something to think about. Okay. In terms of the tools, one thing that's been used is a health impact assessment. And that's rather different to looking at the public health consequences of a process and trying to assess them. Because the first doesn't say do it, but health impact assessments about looking at the pros and cons, the risks and the benefits of doing something, and then looking at mitigating the circumstances. I think we heard a very good description from Emma there about how SEPA, for instance, would look at mitigating and trying to prevent any problems that emerge. But that does beg the question, upstream, should we be doing it? And then we look at how we can control it. I'll give you an example of what the unconventional gas industry has done in Scotland. This is an environmental statement which contains within it some health impacts. Admittedly, later on, there were more detailed ones. But within this, there's a couple of pages on health impacts, effects on humans. You can see at the back, it's a fairly flimsy document. And from that, the industry said, everything is absolutely fine. Don't worry, go ahead. This document is from Colorado, from a small town in Colorado, and it's a health impact assessment of a proposed unconventional gas development. And it's pages and pages. And what it does is look at what the exposures might be, what the risks might be, what the benefits might be in terms of job creation, what the losses might be in terms of the activity being there, and with regard to job creation as well. And it looks at mental health and well-being. And I cannot find in any of the UK industry's work any detailed assessment of mental health and well-being. Positions very different in the US. So we need to look carefully at how these tools are used. So in there, you get a health profile of the community. You'd particularly pick up vulnerable groups. You would look at the sorts of things we've heard about earlier in terms of air, soil, water quality and where there might be exposures and what levels would cause a problem. Yes, you'd look at noise, vibration and light. Yes, you'd look at traffic. Then you would look at community wellness and mental health. And you would look at health infrastructure. Remember these things because socio-economic impacts have big public health impacts as well. So those are the sorts of things you would expect to see in a good health impact assessment. Now, what we've got is rather different. Again, can you read that at the back? Yep. We've got something that came out of Public Health England. And it came out as a draft document in 2012, and then they updated it in 2013. And the Westminster government said, before this report came out, we want fracking. There's nothing wrong with fracking. And as long as we regulate the industry properly, and as long as the industry carries out good practice, then everything will be fine. So this was the review of the potential public health impacts of exposures. Not a public health impact assessment, a detailed one, but it effectively was reviewing the literature. Health Protection Scotland then said, we don't have the expertise to look at this, so we'll take the Health Protection England report. And what happens? When you look at that report, what is it saying? The authors of the report themselves said, we've not looked at wider public health impacts, some of the things I've just mentioned. We've not looked at the effects on global climate change. And don't forget, what goes up comes down, so global climate change will come back to Scotland in some form or another and have public health implications. They did nothing on socio-economic impacts that might affect health, and they did nothing on work environments. So those were the gaps they themselves admitted. Then the BMJ ran an editorial looking at this particular report, and it's carried a lot of weight in Scotland. Not the BMJ editorial. The BMJ editorial said the report is a leap of faith, unsubstantiated by scientific evidence, in claiming that US public health problems probably won't apply to the UK. Its conclusions that shale gas presents a low public health risk is not substantiated by the literature. It ignores the inherent industry risks, whatever regulation applies, and that would be relating to things like casing failure, cement failure, wastewater spillage, and so on. And it ignores the implications of having unconventional gas extraction in heavily populated areas. And the picture that Emma had up was in the US, where, in fact, there are going to be big gaps between the various wells. Often there won't be communities there. Go to the central belt of Scotland, and the position is rather different. So it's raining for me. So I don't intend to go into detail on regulation. I think Emma's given us a very good picture of what that is. But just to flag up a few points, because you can say, well, here's a really good system, and it always works. And some people say, hang on a minute, on paper systems may work, but what happens in practice? And a while ago, some geologists looked at boreholes in the UK, and they found that there were really quite significant problems with them. There was poor monitoring. This is the UK, so we're not talking specifically about Scotland. This is the UK. There was poor monitoring, and they found they got orphaned wells. In other words, industries and companies had gone and left them, and nobody was dealing with them. And there were a small number of cases of well failure that they recorded. But basically, the response of the Westminster government has been to say, well, that's not really a problem. And there's countervailing forces here, because in Westminster, they're talking about getting rid of red tape. They don't want regulation to fetter industry. They've run down the Environment Agency. They've run down the Health and Safety Executive, two big bodies that have a major role in England in terms of dealing with unconventional gas. So there are worries there in terms of the assessment that's been made. We've heard reference to the Scottish Scientific Panel on unconventional gas. And that was a weird group, because there was nobody on it who was a public health expert. Indeed, there were no health experts at all. There were no independent experts on regulation, which is needed to assess how the things work. And there were no independent experts on industry environmental performance. So I think, alarm bells might start ringing there about how rigorous the setup is. I won't go into detail on the HSE, but it's interesting to see what's driving them, and indeed drives quite a lot of regulators now across the UK. And this is about privileging business as much as public health, rather than privileging public health and then privileging business. And the HSE said, we'll operate the precautionary principle, but we'll do so on the basis of proportionality and consistency. And HSE changed its high-level principles away from protecting workers, dealing with the workers on boreholes and sites, to saying, well, in fact, we need to encourage industry and also to regulate it. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. It'll be interesting to see how that works through. Emma's referred to DEC, so I'm going to focus on what DEC is saying, because if we're looking at fracking, we don't have fracking in Scotland yet, but there have been exploratory sites in England, and this is the line that DEC has been taking, that in fact all of the fracked fluids are assessed, and they're done so on a case-by-case basis for each well, which begs the question about how you can say exactly what fluids will be used in what process. They say operators must declare the full details of the chemicals, but when you start to drill down to this, pardon the expression, what you find out is that, in fact, the details of these products are commercially sensitive. And a number of these regulators will not be in a position legally to disclose them. So where's the transparency there? And then they then go on, and I think Emma referred to it, lots of household agents, present in some of these fracking fluids, so we're told. the bactericides and so on. So if we rely on best industry practice, who's establishing best industry practice? What is best industry practice? Is best industry practice going to protect your public health or not? Begs the question. That's why you want this independent and rigorous oversight of what they're doing. DEC then said, well, don't worry, because Quadrilla, which obviously is heavily involved in unconventional gas, uses very small number of substances. Indeed, it uses things that are in cosmetics. So you don't have to worry about that. And it uses hydrochloric acid, which you get in swimming pools, so you don't have to worry about that. But when you look closely at what they're saying, and I'll give you one specific example in a moment, it really doesn't stack up. The Advertising Standards Agency, which has a mixed reputation, said that Quadrilla, in fact, could not say that its fracking fluid did not contain hazardous or toxic components. And it went further and it said, the company's given the impression that claims were universally accepted, which we consider was not the case. We conclude that the claims, we also know that hydraulic fracturing does not lead to contamination of the underground aquifer, and there is no evidence of aquifer contamination from hydraulic fracturing. It was not the case. So one would hope to see that popping up in some government settings and people saying, well, the industry says this, but we can't always trust them. There could be these significant problems. You won't be able, I think, to see this at the back, but this is part of the Quadrilla claim that DEC put forward. And it said you get these things in cosmetics. I don't use one, you get them in chapsticks, common cosmetics. And when in fact some researchers looked at this, first of all, they couldn't find polyacrylate on the data sheets of these particular products. And then when they looked at it, they found that there could be all sorts of problems with residues, that in fact, when some of these boreholes were drilled, it would affect this particular additive and it would become far more toxic. And indeed, what the company had done was pick out the least toxic, even though that is toxic, the least toxic additive, and they could have illustrated perhaps more honestly by looking at a bigger range. So when we see how these industries operate, we get a very different picture. David Michaels is in fact the head of an Obama government regulatory body, and he looked at how the oil industry in particular dealt with research and tried to rubbish that research. And the argument that he had was that effectively industry tries to delay and stop regulation on the basis of perfectly reasonable research by constantly challenging it. And a nice example of this, and it's something that could be involved in a variety of ways with regard to unconventional gas extraction, is benzene. And in 1948, the industry research body, American Petroleum Institute, said that yes, we accept that benzene causes leukemia, and that we also accept that the only absolutely safe concentration of benzene is 0. That was the industry. And then immediately after that, they started to say, oh, well, actually, that's not the case. And they constantly challenged the debate about what were safe standards of exposure for benzene. And in the UK, the regulator, this isn't CEPA, the regulator HSE was saying, well, you know, we don't really need to go below 10 parts per million. Remember, I was talking about parts per billion and parts per trillion at the beginning. We don't need to go below 10 parts per million because we've got very good standards. But then, surprise, surprise, 1992, they brought it down to 5. And then in 2014, it's down to 1. But what are the Americans saying? The Americans are saying there are effects below 1 part per million with regard to exposure to benzene. They're saying it could be damaging to the immune system, it could cause cancer, it could do genetic damage as well. And lo and behold, when more research came out, it was saying that, in fact, you can't draw these conclusions about you just gradually reduce the exposure and you're going to reduce the damage, because there are some chemicals that don't behave like that, particularly endocrine disruptors. So it may be extremely low levels that cause the damage. So they flagged that up, and then they said, bearing in mind vulnerable groups, they said, benzene crosses the human placenta and is also found in human breast milk, and that children and infants may be more susceptible to these substances than adults. And then they found that there was an issue in terms of a possible relationship between parental, occupational and environmental exposures to benzene and birth defects. And now the NIOSH researchers are talking about exposure levels of below 0.1 part per million. So you rarely see these levels going up, the relaxing controls. As more and more research comes in, they go down. But the industry itself in 1948 was saying there was a problem. And this is in the environmental health perspectives, by the way. National Institute of Environmental Health and Safety, not some sort of cowboy outfit. It's in the mainstream scientific literature. So I've said a little bit there about endocrine disruptors that can affect development, that may have reproductive damage, that in fact could cause cancer. And they looked at whether or not, with regard to hydraulic fracturing chemicals, any of these were present around wells. And I won't go into detail, but in fact there were a significant number of them that were popping up in water samples. Now it's very important that you look at how studies are designed and how significant they are. But what we are seeing, undoubtedly, and again I'll come back to this right towards the end, is a picture of more and more problems emerging, not fewer. American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, it also decided that there could be real problems in terms of vulnerable groups with regard to exposures to environmental agents. And a number of these, again, are used in fracking. May be used in other unconventional gas extraction techniques as well. So these are mainstream, highly respected professional bodies that are saying there could be real difficulties. Emma very helpfully gave us the chart which indicates roughly what water usage would be, what silica usage would be, which is a big issue for workers, you know, sand and exposures, and also the additives in there, and to what extent biocides and other substances might be significant. So you could look at that and say, not a lot, but you're thinking, how much causes the damage? Very little could cause the damage if there's the exposure. So another way of looking at it might be to see how much water is used per well and what the percentage of biocides in some of these wells might be, and what quantities would you get at the end. So if you had one well, and the estimate, low estimate, is 2 million gallons of water would be used, you could be ending up with possibly 1,000 gallons of biocide. And if you get wells, as they may be, fracked 8 times, then you start to multiply it up. And you could be talking about very significant exposure levels. The American Public Health Association, by the way, has come up with a much higher figure in terms of additive usage. That may relate to geological differences, it may not. But if we're looking at the research, how is this picture developing? I don't expect you to be able to read this, but again, it's from a peer-reviewed scientific paper. And they were picking up issues in terms of air concentration and exposures to, for instance, benzene and formaldehyde. And other researchers were saying that an increasing body of studies suggests that water contamination risks exist through a variety of pathways with regard to unconventional gas extraction, most notably during wastewater transport. And it would be great if, as Emma says, there are these tight controls and nothing ever gets out and nothing ever contaminates anything. Sadly, the history of engineering is that that never ever happens. So it'll be the debate about what are the levels, what are the pathways, how many people are affected, and could there be adverse ill effects. I won't go into detail on the workers, but that is also a big issue. I have here another paper that specifically relates to biocides, and it's from Colorado. And in Colorado in 2013, they looked at could there be problems on the surface with regard to leaks. And they found there were 580 leaks recorded. Now, we could say, well, when this comes in Scotland or in England, the system will be much better. But they thought, well, we'll have a look at these biocides and what they do. And they found a number of them were entirely non-toxic, but when in fact they were mixed with other additives in the the fracking process or the coal bed methane process, they became very toxic indeed. And they also found there were significant gaps about the effects that some of these substances cause. So data indicating problems and significant gaps. I mentioned the direction of travel. Now, I think you'd have to treat this one with a little bit of circumspection because it's from the Concerned Health Professionals of New York, and what they did was look at the scientific literature and media reports that were picking up problems with unconventional gas and seeing what the papers were saying. So I've discounted the media reports completely. You know, we ignore those, they're entirely inaccurate. But just looking at the scientific papers, you've got there water, air and health in those circles. And the papers showing problems are in blue, and the papers showing no problems, no health problems, are in red. So you can see the direction of travel there is very much that more and more is being found out about the potential problems of exposures. And what one would hope to see with unconventional gas is not so much a public health impact assessment, but a life cycle assessment from a public health point of view, which looked at not just the fracking process and the materials coming in, but the production of materials to get the fracking and then the consequences down the line. And if you look, you'll find hazards attached with the unconventional gas extraction industry in terms of climate change, work environment, air pollution, water, mental health, employment and economic benefits. The issue will be, what are the risks associated with those hazards? What will the exposures be? And have people looked at the total picture? So where do we stand then in terms of what's going on in Scotland? The number of Scottish NHS bodies then, if we're looking at good data that's out there, that have conducted health impact assessments of unconventional gas, none. The number of Scottish Government departments that have conducted independent public health impact assessments, and we await to see what happens with the moratorium, none. The number of proper baseline public health studies in Scottish areas where unconventional gas may be developed, you may see a pattern developing here, none. And part of that is because the NHS quite rightly has said it doesn't have the resources to do this, and therefore is sort of passing the buck or the responsibility up the line. The number of full unconventional gas public health impact assessments in the UK as a whole, none. We do know about the chemicals, and as some of these things are going to be done on a well-by-well basis, we don't know yet the details of all of them, but certainly in the US up to 750 chemicals have been used. So there's bound to be some of those used in the UK, in Scotland. The number of these chemicals that have been publicly disclosed with all the details, in other words, no commercial confidentiality, well, we don't know, but at the moment there's none, because we can't see them, we're the public. The number of chemicals that have been independently assessed, well, some researchers in the US have looked at 350 of them. And of those 350, the percentage that were carcinogens and mutagens, cancer-causing substances and could cause various types of cell damage, 25%. The number that were endocrine disruptors that could affect development, reproduction, and also possibly be cancer-causing, 37%. And if you think about what the problems are with exposure, researchers at Tufts, highly respected researchers in the nanotoxicology field, have been looking at this, and they've come out with the fact that endocrine disruptors may cause an effect, an adverse effect, in parts per trillion. So that's the equivalent of a teaspoon in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. So if somebody says, well, there's only going to be a few drops, you want to know what is the significance of that. Can we measure it? Should we be concerned? Should we adopt a precautionary principle? And the Norwegians and the Swedes, way ahead of us, have actually tried to cost out what the implications might be of endocrine disruptors. These are endocrine disruptors across industry, by the way, not just talking about unconventional gas. And they found out that, in fact, up to 40% of the health costs associated with several serious male reproductive problems were due to endocrine disruptors. And that was costing them something like 1,200 million ECU across the EU. So if you're looking at cost-benefit, risk-benefit and impacts, this should be part of the picture. Number of chemicals worldwide that we've got good details on, really good toxicology assessments, probably under 25%. And perhaps Emma and her colleague might answer this one. The number of new field and lab regulatory staff available to monitor unconventional gas in environmental health and occupational health or fire, we don't know. And obviously it's very difficult for the regulators because it's not in yet. One assumes that if it does come in, then there'll be an increase in numbers. But the position's very unclear. Okay, coming to the end now. It's always interesting to look at what the industry itself is doing. And industry has become very concerned that there have been in France, in parts of Germany, in New York State, and a range of other places, there have been either these delays, the moratorium, or bans on unconventional gas. So they asked the consultancy to look at how it was dealing with these things. And the consultants analysed why these groups were effective. And the consultant said this was because these groups focused on knowledge gaps, potential and real regulatory deficiencies, problems with local regulation enforcement, the emphasis given to the precautionary principle. I work in public health. Those are exactly the sort of things that would concern me. So effectively, the groups were identifying what are potentially very serious problems with the way that the industry operates. Emma's already put this slide up, and it begs some other questions. Because if we're told, as we were, if the Westminster government, and then it was repeated in parts within Scotland, if the Westminster government said, well, we can carry out unconventional gas extraction because there is tight regulation and because industry practice is good, why do we need to change anything then? Why are they now talking about commissioning a full public health impact assessment? Shouldn't they have done that before? What's the reason for doing it now? We're told that planning is very good, but they're going to strengthen it. Well, hang on, we were told before all the planning controls were in place, everything would be fine. And then they're looking at further tightening up environmental regulation. Well, we were told it was absolutely fine before. So something doesn't quite ring true there. And finally, the reasons it doesn't ring true, I think, are because of some of these big reports that have pulled together the scientific literature that's looking at shale gas development. And in New York State, on the left-hand side, they produced this report. It's a public health review. 4,800 hours was spent on it, and they had 20 public health professionals looking at it. And on the basis of this, the New York governor decided to stop any fracking in New York State. And the reasons they did this, the reasons that they said were, the risks were simply not fully understood, that public health impacts could be geographically very broad, not within a certain area, that the weight of evidence shows significant uncertainty about adverse health outcomes. And they specifically said the research highlighted the negative impacts in terms of air quality, in terms of healthcare, in terms of social determinants of health as well. So there were a series of physical things, and there were a series of these socio-economic adverse influences as well. American Public Health Association, and I never see any of these bodies cited by any UK government source in terms of saying, well, this is good and that is bad, and here are the problems. The sun always seems to shine and the rain always seems to stop. The American Public Health Association said, what we want in terms of potential public health threats is greater transparency and the use of a precautionary approach in the face of uncertainty. They also say that in terms of assessing whether or not unconventional gas will slow global warming, they're saying it's not going to make any significant difference. So that's a a big minus right at the beginning. Could have been a good reason for doing it. Fracking poses potential risks to public health and the environment and raises concerns about groundwater, surface water contamination, climate change, all the things that I just mentioned in the New York report. They further go on and say vulnerable populations, particularly children and low-income rural populations, are most likely to be negatively affected by fracking. And then they make the point that fracking chemicals that are added to water have raised public health concerns about these issues. And this is their figure now. I gave you a very conservative one. Additives used in fracturing fluids typically make up less than 2% by weight of the total fluid. But over the life of a well, this may amount to 100,000 gallons of chemical additives. And they point out there are research gaps. And they finish by saying that these challenges to research are unlikely to be overcome in the immediate future. However, the reports, agency documents and environmental models that we've got suggest that this process presents unique and significant health concerns. That's why public health professionals are concerned about what's being proposed in Scotland.